Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Countdown to DSCSA 2017, Mastering Serialization for External Supply. I'm Tim Wright, Editor of Contract Pharma. Today's webinar is being sponsored by TraceLink, the world's largest track and trace network for connecting the life science supply chain. The company's Life Sciences Cloud is the only track and trace platform used by pharmaceutical companies in global markets that comprise 75% of the world's drug supply and represents a supply chain network with nearly 200,000 members. Before we get started, a few quick announcements. We will be accepting questions throughout the presentation. You can send those in using the box at the lower left of your screen. Questions will be answered after the presentation in a 15-minute Q&A. Also, today's presentation will be available on our website, contractpharma.com, for 1 year. Our speakers today are Gil Roth of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association and Graham Clark of TraceLink. Together, they'll discuss strategies and offer insights from both pharma's and CMO, CPO perspectives, including what you should do now to ensure your business is ready for 2017 and beyond. All right, Gil, you want to take it away?
Thanks a lot, Tim. Hi, everyone. I'm Gil Roth. I'm the president of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. We're a trade group that represents CMOs and CDMOs throughout the industry in the legislative, regulatory, and general business areas. Today in our conference, we're going to be discussing a number of issues related to serialization and how they relate to DSCSA. You can see a number of the questions on the current slide. We'll be getting to those over the course of the conversation. Now, my background is I was the founding editor at Contract Pharma magazine. I've covered the CMO-CDMO industry from 1999 until 2014 when I left to put together the PBOA. The association is a nonprofit that represents CMOs and CDMOs, as I mentioned, across legislative, regulatory, and general business areas. We work to educate CMOs, bring them into the conversation with Congress, FDA, and other industry groups. You can see on the current slide a number of our members, as well as several of our affiliate members, like Interfex, FarmSource, and TraceLink. The affiliate members are companies whose goods and services assist the CMO-CDMO world. Now, our main speaker today is Graham Clark from TraceLink, in charge of CMO-CPO partnerships. And Graham, can you tell us a bit about your role and your background?
I can, Gil, and thanks for joining me on the webinar today. My background is I've been in the computer industry for more than 30 years, 20 years of that with IBM and Microsoft on the software side. And for the last 12 years, I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry with a primary focus on track and trace and serialization. So I've been focused on this space for a long time. For about the last year or so, I've been exclusively focused on working with the contract manufacturing and contract packaging side of the business. And in the last year, I've probably spoken to 50 or 60 different contract providers, in addition to working with many of the large global manufacturers that work with them. So I've worked with packages in the U.S., in Europe, and in India.
Great. Can you tell us a bit about TraceLink and the Life Sciences Cloud?
Yeah, so I think during the introduction there was mention of TraceLink and the Life Science Cloud. I think it's worth going back. TraceLink originally started as SupplyScape back in 2003 when the original team was formed from the group at MIT that was doing work on e-pedigree. When California pushed the e-pedigree legislation in 2009, we reformed ourselves as TraceLink, and we really tried to step back and look at the challenges that the industry saw with the first generation of e-pedigree and serialization. And we decided to redevelop a solution based on the Amazon cloud infrastructure. And the two things we were trying to address was how you address massive scalability of billions of serial numbers, and where a customer might have to integrate with hundreds or even thousands of trading partners. So those are two classic problems that we believe only a cloud infrastructure could solve. So today, TraceLink works with nearly 200 pharmaceutical and life science companies including 16 of the top 20 global pharma companies. Those companies exchange information primarily with the US DSCSA legislation with about 193,000 supply chain partners. And that can be wholesalers and other people, endpoints, doctors' offices, hospitals, pharmacies, etc. And I think if people out there still believe or still wonder whether or not any of the regulations like DSCSA or any of the specific country regulations will be enforced or be executed, then the numbers in this chart actually tell the story of that. To date, just TraceLink has exchanged nearly 30 million transactional documents in support of the US DSCSA legislation. When you receive a product, you have to receive a transaction ahead of actually receiving that product. We've also managed about 500 million serialized units, so primarily for other countries outside the US where they have earlier regulations. And the pharma companies that we work with are in process of trying to engage and onboard about 680 contract manufacturers and packagers to be ready for primarily for the US and European legislations. So there's a lot going on. If you take 680 CMOs and divide it by the 2 years we've got left before the US legislation kicks in, that's about 25 CMOs a month that have got to be fully serialized. That's a lot of work. And so the purpose of today is really to address some of the questions that people have about getting ready for serialization and some of the key questions that go along with that. So I'm looking forward to discussing those with you, Gil.
Great. I think the industry has a lot of questions. You spoke at a workshop that we held for PBOA members last March, and I know there was a lot of interest after that about how the industry is going to address serialization. And I know some players are very advanced in their offerings, and others are still trying to work out their responsibilities and capital funding, et cetera. So why don't we start by asking what the current regulations are, both domestically and globally, and how you think they're going to affect CMOs?
So this chart shows a number of the regulations that are occurring or coming into place around the world in a timeline. And I think the key point is by the end of 2018, about 40 markets will have regulations that impact 75% of all global prescription medicines. So serialization, which most of them are based on, is going to impact every country and every pharmaceutical company and every partner that those pharma companies work with. The second point that I'd make on this is that you can see to the far left dates back as far as 2013. So countries like China, Argentina, Turkey, and India already have serialization programs. And those serialization programs actually involve CMOs today. Some of the early programs that will run with Big Pharma actually included CMOs for solutions for China, for example. I think what we're seeing, though, is as the US and Brazil and China really kick in volume, and as the EU finalizes its regulations, that the global pharma companies are actually no longer tackling these countries in a tactical manner. They're building global strategies and technology infrastructures to handle these markets in a consistent way. And one of those things has got to be their external manufacturing base. So I think for the CMOs and CPOs attending the webinar, I think they're probably looking at the US requirement, November 2017, and then the EU requirement slightly after that as the key timelines that they're working with. The other point I'd make about this from a CMO CPO perspective, and we're going to talk about this later, is that the large pharma companies typically have their global budgets for serialization in place, but they've only done it for their internal lines. So in many instances, the global companies don't even have a person responsible for CMO serialization, and they're just beginning to bring those people on board now. So this is really, we're late getting started from the external manufacturing standpoint. There's a lot to get done, as you can see from this chart. And I think there's one key question that I come up to when I talking to contract manufacturers, and that is a quote that we got from a global customer of ours just fairly recently, which is this statement: no serialization equals no sales. So if you think about where you are from a standpoint of serialization, I think the question that every contract provider should ask themselves is, what happens if you aren't able to meet your customer serialization requirement deadlines? It may be that they haven't told you what their requirements are, but the deadline that they have is firm. And so if they're not telling you, perhaps you should be asking.
Understood.
I think at this point we have a poll question, which is to the audience out there, which is, have you initiated serialization conversations with your pharmaceutical partners? And I think the way that we'd like people to answer this is yes, if you've done this at a program level or to multiple partners, but if it's just onesie-twosie ad hoc discussions, probably the answer should be no to this one, since you really need to be tackling this across your entire partner base.
And the audience can fill in the poll now?
They should, yes.
So
and I think we're going to give... Sorry.
I was just going to say, with the deadlines coming in 2017 for the U.S. and 2018 for the EU, doesn't that give CMOs some time to prepare? Like, why should they be jumping on board this early?
Well, I think that's the common belief, Gil. Firstly, the answer to the question, in terms of have you initiated discussions with your customers, the answer is, from a percentage standpoint, no is over 70% of the respondents. So, which is what I see in practice when I'm out talking to CMOs and CPOs, which is the majority of those companies have not initiated those discussions. So back to your question, though, Gil, which is what are the timelines and when do CMOs need to be ready? I think that the belief is that they have a lot of time. And so what I'm going to do is, as we go through the questions, I'm going to build the considerations and try and put an answer to the question about when, what the timelines are and when the CMOs need to be ready.
Right.
So this is the timeline I'm going to use for a few slides. And so what it shows is serialization projects from CMOs and the actual timeline leading up to the third quarter of 2017, November 2017 being the date when pharmaceutical manufacturers in the United States have to be shipping nothing but serialized product. Now, there's still question about grandfathering provisions in the channel, but from the manufacturer standpoint, which also means the contract manufacturer, they cannot sell serialized product into the channel after that date. And stepping back from that date, most of the pharma companies that we talk to put a buffer against that. So the latest typically that we've seen requirements from the pharma companies is about 6 months before that. So by, say, March 2017 is when they're expecting all CMO products to be serialized and from those serialization lines to be validated in production. And taking a step back from that further, one of the global pharma companies that we work with, which is a top 10 global company, has set a deadline for its contract providers of June of 2016 for when they're expecting all of their products to be serialized in production. And that is 9 months from now. And so those are the dates that we're starting with. And if you actually build on top of that where we are today at the end of the third quarter of 2015, that actually gives a time period of 18 months from, in many cases, no serialization at all to all serialization across all lines. So that's the window that the pharma companies and the contract providers are actually working to when they think about the timeline. Remember, you can't sell a product that is not serialized after November 2017, which probably means March 2017 is the deadline for the CMOs to be shipping serialized product.
So getting to the next question, what are the major components for a CMO to implement this, and how long does it take to implement?
And I think this is one of the issues that I've commonly seen, probably the most common issue I've seen in my discussions with the contract providers, is understanding the components and the time it takes to implement the components across their organization. And I think it's just one of those things, because historically IT has not reached down as far as the packaging line, because there's not been variable data printed on the product. They probably just don't have enough experience with understanding all of the components that need to be installed and how long they're going to take. So what is shown on this slide is layers 1, 2, 3. Typically, people in serialization refer to 5 layers in a serialization stack. The first 3 layers are shown here and should be considered to be site level or plant level. And typically those are the upgrade equipment that you need to put onto your packaging lines, which may be more or less depending on whether you're aggregating the serialized units or not. The layer above that is the control of the packaging line. And then above that is the site level server, which might be handling serialization functions, or it might be handling some warehouse functions as well, depending on the type of organization. Above this is the enterprise serialization software. So typically this is, if you're a multi-site organization, this is where all of that serialized information comes together into your enterprise or global repository of information. It's also where you track the aggregation hierarchies, where you do interfacing to the ERP system, where you put all your master data from products and your customers. And then the level above that, we typically call that the network layer. This is the layer where you're actually exchanging information with your pharmaceutical customers, or if you're a pharmaceutical customer, you're also reporting into government agencies. And the reason I've color-coded them this way is this is the way that typically the vendor space is separated. So levels 1, 2, and 3 typically come from the line management vendors or the line system vendors, and levels 4 and 5 typically come from a different set of software providers that don't touch the lines, and this is an area where TraceLink falls into. So these are the components that we typically see, and as we move forward, we're going to talk about the implementation and the criteria around each of these components.
Can you talk about the 1 through 3 suppliers here?
So the first ones to talk about are the packaging suppliers, and I think there'll be a lot of familiar names here, since typically the people that have provided packaging solutions pre-serialization have all moved into the serialization space with solutions. And these companies actually started back for the California deadline. So a lot of these companies were offering serialization solutions back in the 2007 and 2008 timeframe. I think where we are now, because of the large number of internal lines that the global pharma companies have serialized, these companies have developed quite a lot of experience in terms of implementing and upgrading lines and getting them validated and in production with serialization. So that's the good news. What we've learned is that it typically takes about 9 months for a line to basically be upgraded and put into production. I think that the challenge is going to be that as we see the ramp in the number of serialization projects, that a number of these companies being very small, there's going to be a resource shortage. And in addition to that, we'll start to see lead times on equipment, which are currently running at about 20 weeks. We'll start to see those lead times expand. So that 9-month implementation per line is likely to be stretched out. The good news, though, is these guys have got a lot of experience. You should still check references or multiple references before you make a decision here. But these people are having successful implementations today.
Great. Now, actually, one of the questions I had on the side was when we had our presentation at our workshop in March, you referred to the global serialization tsunami. But this looks more like an avalanche in terms of a cascading set of problems. If you keep putting it off, it gets worse and worse and worse. Which potential disaster do you think is more appropriate for describing how CMOs who keep putting this off are going to be in trouble?
I actually think it's unfortunate that I think we're going to talk about the level 1, 2, 3 and the level 4 and 5 because both of them effectively need to be started immediately. And I think, unfortunately, both of them have to be tackled in parallel. I mean, I don't think it's a case where you can focus on one and not focus on the other. If we go back to the chart, the timeline I was using, and just show that 18-month timeline that we had, if we take the line upgrades and layer that on top of that, what you'll see is, depending on how many sites and how many packaging lines you actually have, you've effectively got to stagger these lines into that 18-month window. And this is obviously going to be a problem. We've seen projects with big pharma companies where they had a project timeline with a contract provider, and there was a 6-month delay in that 9-month project because they were operating on a shared line and the CMO had to handle the manufacturing scheduling issues because they had other companies or customers that wanted to operate on that line. So there's a lot of scheduling issues around this, but still, depending on how many lines you've got to manage, there is a lot of work here. The other issue with the lines is that, and this is why I think people have deferred as long as they have in terms of doing upgrades to their lines, is that a typical line might take $250,000 to $500,000 to upgrade. And so the CMOs are unlikely to get paid by the brands for doing that work in advance, and so they tend to defer it until they get solid marching orders from their customers. What that means is that these line upgrades are just pushing against that March 2017 deadline, and this is the first major challenge. The second thing I wanted to put on this, Gil, was the other side of it, which is if the level 1, 2, 3 and multiple lines represents a lot of work and a lot of expense, then what about integrating the level 4 and 5 to your pharmaceutical customers? And so what I'm showing here is I'm showing an integration project to actually take the serial numbers from the pharmaceutical company, put them on your lines, and then turn them around and send them back. And our experience working with global brands, but also working with contract manufacturers, is that these software projects to actually do the interfacing and validation between the CMO and the pharma company also take about 9 months in duration by the time you've done the design, the documentation, the development, the validation, and the end-to-end testing. So there's another 9 months that gets layered in parallel to do with that integration. So both of these things have got 9-month-ish duration projects that have to be implemented.
But the IT side is scalable while the physical implementation doesn't have a time reduction for doing 4 different lines as opposed to one line, 4 times?
I think we're going to come to that question because I think we're going to find out that the picture I'm showing here is what probably most CMOs would think the scenario is, and maybe even what a lot of brands think the scenario is, but we'll actually uncover this story a little bit more as we go along.
Let's tackle the next question, which is something that some CMOs have brought up with both of our parties. Customer sends a CMO a survey and a deadline, but the CMO wants to know, what else do I need to ask them? Can I just wait for them to tell me exactly what they want?
Well, I think that the challenge, we've already seen that from the first survey question, that a lot of those discussions are not happening right now. And when I typically talk to a CMO that maybe has 50 customers and I ask them if they've actually had requirements from the 50 customers, they'll tell me that maybe 2 or 3 of them are engaged with them in a discussion, but they haven't heard anything from the others. Typically now, the larger of the pharma companies are beginning to share requirements, or at least to share some sort of information. Typically, if you're working with smaller and virtual pharma companies, they're actually waiting for their CMOs to provide input to them. The questions, though, that need to be answered, it's not enough for a pharma company just to say, okay, we need you to be serialized for our product by June of 2016. There are other things that a CMO needs to know. So there are a range of regulatory requirement type questions. The most obvious questions are, which countries do I need to support and what are the timelines for those countries? But also the question of aggregation. Aggregation is not required by the US DSCSA legislation, but some brands will ask for aggregation from day one, whereas some of the generic companies will not want aggregation. So there's a whole set of questions around the regulatory requirements that you need to understand from your customers. Secondly, there are a whole set of technical integration and validation requirements. What we'll see is that the pharma companies don't always have the same specification for their technical integration, and they certainly don't all have the same validation requirements. So getting clarity around these is also critical for the CMO, again, on a customer-by-customer basis. The third area is in terms of the commercial arrangements. With many of the early pilots, we saw that the brands actually paid for some of the line equipment to be installed. That is not the scalable model. So what is the model? When will the pharma company pay the CMO for serialized product? Or will they pay at all for serialized product? So the whole area of the commercial arrangement is something where we still don't see a lot of discussions happening. And then lastly, the project timing. It's not just enough to send out, we want everything ready by June of 2016. There are all the sub-steps that have to be done. There's the integration of the transactions. There's any testing that needs to be scheduled into that. There's upgrading of the labeling that needs to be done and shared. There's quite a lot of stuff that goes into a detailed project plan to make these things happen. And one of the things that we intend to do on the website post the webinar is actually provide a set of questions that we think are appropriate for a CMO to ask of their pharmaceutical customers.
Great. Because that's one of the major issues that CMOs face in a lot of different areas is this current question. They've received different requirements from different customers. How can I handle them? Within serialization, that's the question about standardization and how CMOs should adjust. So, Graham?
I think that this is one that I think is the least well understood area of CMO brand integration, which is where everyone or people in serialization are familiar with GS1 and EPCIS standards and various other standards in this area. There is a group working on a standard way for the level 3 site level systems to connect to level 4. So there's a lot of work going on in standards. But the one area where there isn't a standard, where people might think there is a standard, is this whole area of how the pharma company works with the CMO. So on this chart, what I'm showing here is firstly the subhead. Internal system design leads to unique and complex integration. What typically happens here is that a large pharma company will develop a system for internal serialization. They'll start implementing, upgrading their own lines and implementing enterprise software to receive the data off those lines. The next thing that happens is they take all of those internally developed interfaces and they promote those as their interface to the contract providers. So rather than actually looking for a standard interface, they take what they've developed through their internal systems and they publish that as the way they want to receive information from their CMOs. And so the table here on the left, where I've got pharma companies 1 through 30 listed, shows an analysis that we at TraceLink have done of the top 30 global pharma companies by revenues. And what we've done is we've actually taken inventory of their integration requirements. And this is obviously just a simple form of it, but what you can see is that we classify some as having a fairly simple and a standard interface, some where they have not actually defined their interface for exchange of information with their CMO, and others where they have complex and unique interface requirements. And across to the right-hand side here, in the small print, you can actually see an example of just one transaction making up part of an interface between one brand and its CMOs. And if anyone were to really dig in and look at this, what you'd see, it says there are a lot of one-off type, unique type requirements. And so we see this all the time, and this is a huge challenge because what it means is that out of the top 30 companies, we found so far that 10 have complex and unique requirements unrelated to any standard or any form of doing these things, and another 11 have not yet defined their interface requirements. So 21 of the top 30 pharma companies by revenues have got either no standard defined or they've got a complex and unique requirement for integrating with their CMOs. And this now, if we actually take this forward and map this back to our chart where we look at the complexity of integration, we're still showing that complexity of upgrading all of the unique lines, but now we can add on top of that the potential need to do a specific interface for each customer that you work with. So you now got the multiplier of 9 months per line, which has to be fitted in with your manufacturing schedule, and now you've got potentially 9 months per customer to do the data integration with them. So now we're looking at a massive amount of work, which is very resource intensive, and the chance of getting this done in 18 months for a company that has any number of pharmaceutical clients is going to be very, very difficult. So this is, if you like, this is where we go back to the tsunami because now we've got just an inordinate amount of work that has to be done.
Yeah, I'm still going with avalanche over tsunami on this, but that brings us to our next poll question. As CMOs, are you concerned about losing customers if you're not prepared for serialization? So I think it's an opportunity for our audience to start answering.
And I think it typically just takes a few seconds for people to click their buttons and for us to get the results in. So we'll give them a few seconds.
Early results are pretty heartening.
I'm not seeing any results at the moment, Gil. I don't know about you.
So far we've got 12 respondents coming in, all saying yes, they are in fact concerned about losing customers. So we're at 100%. Everyone's concerned who's attending this so far. And there's a few more coming in. Nobody is unconcerned. We'll put it that way. So what does that tell us? If every CMO is concerned about losing business because of serialization?
And based on my experience, Gil, and the discussions I've had with you and the other PBOA members, I think that's a very valid concern. So it looks like it's a 95% yes, concerned about not being able to deal with that. Well, one thing I want to come back to is I want to come back to this this complexity of integrating between the CMO and the brand. So this is the exact chart from a couple of slides ago, and I think one thing that we think here is that there is an opportunity here. And so one of the things that we've done after doing the inventory of the requirements of the CMO's customers, the brands, is to actually look at how we actually tackle this problem of integration. And short of there being a standard, which there is not, and from all of my discussions with the major brands, there is no interest, although there might be a desire, there's no interest in actually doing it. There are really two ways to tackle this integration. The first one was the one that gave us the parallel lines and the 9 months for each customer we're trying to integrate with. And this is a classic point-to-point connection. So in this case, when you're trying to bring on board a customer, let's say your line is already serialized and you're bringing on board a customer for that line, what you do is you now set up that end-to-end connection. So you look and see, is it a simple, is it complex, and you actually develop and build that connection. Now you've got to do the end-to-end validation to that customer. So your validation is specific to that end client. This is the way that we were doing things pre-2009, back in the days of the California pedigree legislation. The model that I said we were taking to try and turn this into a more network model, we actually term that a network tenant model. And in this model, the CMO actually would connect to a network like TraceLink, and then the network takes responsibility for handling all of the complexity and working with the brands to actually get definitions if there aren't definitions in place. And the benefit of this model is that the CMO actually sets up one integration to the cloud and does one validation as far as its system purview allows, which again is they validate to the cloud, and then the cloud vendor, in this case is TraceLink, takes responsibility for the integration of the second half of the hop to the pharma company, and the pharma company validates to TraceLink as well. Now, there is still likely to be an end-to-end transactional test that flows from the CMO to the brand, but even that is greatly simplified in this model. And so we take this model and we go back to the previous chart where we had all of the parallel orange lines. We go back to a situation where the integration of level 4 and 5 between the CMO and the brand comes back to one single line, one single 9-month project. And so we dramatically reduce the amount of work that is required on behalf of the CMOs. And they are going to have hands full on the line upgrades as it is.
Sure. And that brings us to the big question that every CMO is asking. Who's going to pay for it all? The solutions and extra validation, time and resources. Who's going to make the capital expenditure?
And I think this is a tough one. So I would start off by saying it's definitely changed. 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when the brands were first looking at bringing CMOs on for Korea or for China or for other early markets, I think the brands were interested in investing in the early pilot lines. So we saw CMO lines where, even if it was a shared line, where a single brand paid for the entire level 1 to 3 upgrade just because they wanted to get experience and test out with a CMO this model. Discussions I've had since then with major brands, the brands have universally said to me that when they went for their global serialization budget, it was all focused on internal serialization. It was not focused on their external manufacturing partners. And the most common model that we see now is the brand, if the brand is prepared to pay for serialization, the payment is likely to be a per serial number payment once the product is being serialized. So in terms of the key questions and on costs and resources, here are some summary points that I'd like to leave, I think, people with. The first one is, if we look at the components, the level 1 through 3, remember that's the site level, the packaging lines and the site server, and we look at level 4 and 5, the enterprise and the network layer, then first thing to look at is the cost. Level 1 through 3, $250,000 to $500,000, fairly typical price to upgrade a line to serialization if it's with aggregation. a level 4-5, I think, because it's primarily a software solution, the cost can be significantly lower than that, a fraction of that price. In terms of resource requirements, both of these are fairly high in resource requirements. And in terms of the time to actually implement, for a line, 9 months per line. For a customer, 9 months per customer. What are the variables that a CMO can tweak or play with? Firstly, you should look at your lines and decide if you need to aggregate each of those lines. And that's a decision you make on a line-by-line basis. You need to look at your workload, which customers are on the line, and what their requirements are from a regulatory requirement or an operational requirement. The second one, and I actually think if you talk to the line management vendors, many of them will actually give you quotes for a line with aggregation, without aggregation, and they'll give you an upfront quote on the two-step to aggregation process. So start by upgrading to serialization, then aggregation, and I think it's not too much. It's like 20% uplift if you do a two-step upgrade rather than do a single step to aggregation. The second question is to consolidate serialization or aggregation. Now, this may not be possible since for the CMOs that are focused purely on shipping product into the US market, it's all going to happen at the same time. So you probably don't have much opportunity to actually consolidate serialization workload onto particular lines. In Europe, I think there's more opportunity to do this. Some of the countries have got grandfathering provisions, and I know some of the European CMOs actually ship 20 to 40% of their work outside of the European Union. So potentially there's an opportunity for the EU-based guys to take this approach. The third variable was what we covered on the previous slide, which is you can remove the issue of all of those point-to-point 9-month integrations and look at more of a network tenant type model, as we discussed. And then the last point on this slide is the commercial models. And I've covered these points already. The pharma companies are no longer investing in upgrading CMO lines. This is down to the CMO. The current model is, the primary current model is that the pharma company will pay the CMO per serial number once that product is in production. And what that means is that as CMOs should be talking to their level 1 to 3 vendors and their level 4 and 5 vendors at pricing structures whereby potentially they're deferring as much cost as they can to a point when they're actually getting revenues in for the serialization that they're doing. And there are certainly opportunities for people to be creative doing this thing. And so these are all options that a contract provider can actually have discussions with the industry about, and where people are getting quite creative about putting solutions on the table here.
So how should they get started?
Well, I think for people here talking today, I think getting out and attending webinars or talking to people that have done this is definitely the way to go. The industry has gained a huge amount of experience over the past 10 years in upgrading serialization lines, putting software in place to do these integrations, and managing to a tight timeline. I think the first thing to say is if you haven't started already, then there is no reason to wait. The deadlines are not going to shift. The only thing that you do by waiting is constrict the amount of time that you actually have to do these projects. Also, if you're actually delaying because you want to defer the cost of those upgrades, think about making sure you leave yourself enough time to get them all done. And also think about one opportunity that we advocate to our customers, which is there's no reason to delay solving the integration problem with your customers. Separate out integration from line upgrades. The integration doesn't cost you very much money in advance to get started, and it actually takes a significant amount of the workload off of the project, which takes risk away. So there are definite strategies that a CMO can take here, and definite proven models moving forward. But there are many serious issues and challenges to be addressed. It's a high investment. There are unclear directives from customers. There are complex integration and validation requirements. Lead times equipment are going to get longer. The amount of internal IT staff and external expertise in the market is going to get absorbed probably by the global pharma companies. There are going to be people coming into the industry and attempt to provide solutions here, but we've seen many people come in that don't understand the concept of validation in the pharmaceutical industry, let alone have proven skills in implementing serialization solutions. So the first thing is say, you have to start now. There's no reason for you to delay. It's just adding to the risk. There are going to be events. TraceLink, in addition to this webinar, TraceLink has our customer event coming up September 22nd to 23rd in Washington, D.C. Gil, I know that a number of the PBOA members will be hosting a panel discussion on CMO integration and the issues facing the CMOs.
Yep, we will. It's September 22nd, the first day of Nexus 15.
And for anyone that's interested in coming, we'll have a lot of large branded pharmas there, as well as a number of CMOs talking about the issues, as well as a number of industry experts from inside and outside of TraceLink. And there is a promotional discount available if people would like to attend, or you can reach out to me directly on that. Sorry, let me go back. I missed a point, which I want to make here, which is on this slide. One of the things that we're actually inviting people that are on the webinar to do is, if you're interested in scheduling a one-on-one discussion, or if you'd like to know where your pharmaceutical clients are in terms of their readiness and in terms of publishing their requirements, then it's quite likely that TraceLink knows those requirements, even if they haven't been published out to the CMO community through our work with the large companies. And so I invite you to visit tracelink.com/CMO if you're interested in having a discussion about your particular situation. We'd be happy to talk to you. So, I mean, with that, I think we're going to open up to Q&A.
Great.
So I think the moderator can come back in and we'll...
I think I'm taking the role of moderator for this one. And we'll start actually with a question that occurred to me partway through. Is there anything besides compliance that serialization can add to CMO's operations in terms of a value driver that's positive, as opposed to simply, avoiding being out of compliance?
I think it's a good question, Gil. I do think that in my discussions with CMOs, they are so focused on just being ready for the compliance and for meeting their manufacturer's requirements that many of them don't even want to think about it. I can tell you from the pharma standpoint first that many of the big global pharmas are beginning to ask the question, how can they derive value from this serialization investment? And there are many applications that once you've started serializing a product, there are many applications that you can build that actually provide value based on that infrastructure. So the brands are actually fairly well advanced in starting to explore those values. The CMO, I think, a couple of areas that we've seen on this one. Firstly, some CMOs that are thinking a little more broadly about serialization, the first thing they're thinking about is, if the industry is not going to be ready by March of 2017, and there might be an opportunity for additional customers to join their network. So some of the CMOs that have invested early in serialization are out there talking to the customers saying, if your current partners aren't ready, then we'll be ready for you. So there is an opportunity to take a leadership position in terms of where you are from a serialization readiness standpoint. So I think that's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make for CMOs is that if you're working with small and virtual pharma companies or new pharma companies that don't have a lot of IT infrastructure, in the same way that they outsourced the lot-based DSCSA transactions to 3PLs, there is a likelihood that they will want to outsource serial number management and the complexity of serialization to their CMOs. So there is an opportunity to provide some value-added services around serial number management, potentially in some countries around doing regulatory reporting to government agencies. So there are opportunities around, but I do think that for the majority of CMOs, they're primarily focused on the huge task of getting ready in this 18-month time window that we talked about.
Now, one of our contract packagers asks, can you summarize the total cost of implementation with aggregation capabilities? Is there a general average, or does it really vary by the scope of the line and the scope of the products that it's handling?
You know, and I think I'm not sure I can do it without it's how many lines, how many sites, how many customers. Those are the things that play into it. Given those numbers, I think you can estimate reasonably accurately what a project would cost. You know, again, I'd invite the questioner or anyone else that would like my best take on the answer to that question to go to that tracelink.com/CMO, and I'll provide them with, if you like, a rough calculation of where they should be thinking of the cost. But I'll come back to the key point. The biggest price point is going to be the line upgrades. Some of the other things in terms of the times are more resource and running out of time to do the projects. But the biggest single capital investment is going to be the line upgrade.
Gotcha. Let's see, I have a two-part, maybe three-part question here. Is aggregation a must for 2017? Who's defining the unit of sale for that date? Will it be the bottle of tablets with a serialized label, or the bundle, or the shipper case of the pallet? And do we know that all pharma companies themselves, the customer side, do plan to aggregate by November 2017?
Yeah, this is a really good question. This one is not, for the U.S. at least, let me break it out. It depends on the country. Some countries, the regulations do require full aggregation. The U.S. does not require full aggregation by November 2017. All it requires is item-level serialization. That is, you have to serialize at the saleable unit. That is the unit that gets sold into the pharmacy. Now, that's not the whole story. The challenge for the industry, typically coming back from the three large wholesalers, or the wholesaler community in general, is it's very difficult operationally for them to receive serialized product unless there is aggregation, because they don't want to open all the cases and all the pallets to determine what they've received. So there is pressure back from the wholesale community to do aggregation from an operational efficiency standpoint. And the discussions between those companies and the big pharma companies are likely to be where we're going to see the push for aggregation. And remember, it's an operational requirement which is going to be passed on to the CMO from your brand customers, not because it's a regulatory requirement. Now, the other side of that is the large generic manufacturers, where the majority position still seems to be that they do not want aggregation because of the incremental cost to implement it. So for the CMO, unfortunately, if you're working with branded pharma and generics in the same site or sharing the same lines, you may be forced to adopt aggregation for one set of customers and not for others, and it's not to do with the regulation, it's downstream operational considerations.
Gotcha.
And the last part I'd answer to that question is there's always a piece that says watch this space. These discussions typically continue right to the wire, but I do think that probably for every CMO, they are probably going to have to do some level of aggregation.
Another question. Do you think an innovator company that has one standard of serialization in place will accept a CMO's serialization process if it's different from theirs? In other words, will the customer accept serialization that's not the way they collect it as long as it's going to meet regulations?
No.
Okay.
All the experience we have is that the brands are in a position where they will dictate their standards. And put yourself in the position of the brand. Some of the brands that we work with 600 CMOs. Just one company works with 600 CMOs. They've got to onboard 600 CMOs in a 24-month period. The likelihood that they're going to want to do anything other than their standard interface out to all those partners, it's just not going to happen because they won't be able to manage their own projects. So I think you're going to find that the brands are intransigent because they have to be. And also, the fact that there's no standard is that even though the brands recognize they're putting a lot of pressure and diverse requirements down onto their CMO partners, they're not prepared to go back and re-engineer their internal systems to get to a simpler or more standard interface requirement. So the bad news is that a CMO that works with 25 of the top 50 pharmaceutical brands may very well have to do 25 completely different integrations. And each one of those may require a separate detailed validation. So again, the answer to the question is I think it's unlikely that the brands are going to be flexible because the brands are scrambling just as much as the CMOs.
Understood. Is there anything CMOs can do to try to drive standardization, serialization, at least in terms of best practices, or is it really something that's so driven by the customer side?
I think the barn door may be open and the horse may have gone on that one, Gil. I think that if this discussion was 2 years ago, I think we may have had a shot as an industry of doing something. I think that we're so close to the deadline, even though it's still 21 months away until the U.S. deadline. I think the challenge is, or in fact, it's 2 years away to the U.S. deadline. The challenge is that there's so much work to do, and that these companies have set their direction. I do think that there is huge value in the CMOs coming together and talking and putting their heads around this problem and potentially still making a representation back to pharma. And PBOA, I think, represents probably the first opportunity for the CMO community to do that, and I totally encourage that. But in terms of putting a standard in place between now and when this needs to happen, I think the chances are very slim.
Understood. Last question, slightly hopeful one. What do you believe the outcome of grandfathering will be for a product that's produced and packaged before November 2017 in terms of being allowed into the supply chain after that date by the FDA?
I think that the question of grandfathering is going to differ country by country, but let me give you the answer for the U.S. market, since that's where we are right now, and I imagine where many of the people watching are actually focused on. There is an active discussion around grandfathering in the United States market. However, the discussion regards product in channel. The discussion does not regard product manufactured after the deadline. The pharma companies will not be able to ship unserialized product after the deadline, full stop. There is no discussion of grandfathering at that point. And so that's where we work back from that November 2017 deadline back to the March 17 deadline when the CMO is probably going to have to be in full serialization production. There is no discussion going on about extending the deadline or grandfathering in terms of the pharma companies shipping unserialized product.
Understood. We're going to have to call an end to the webinar. We've reached our hour mark. I want to thank Graham and TraceLink for participating. I also want to point out again, Nexus 2015, the event September 22nd and 23rd in Washington. PBOA will be there with a panel of a number of our member companies talking about CMO issues of serialization. And we're planning to launch a survey of both our members and non-member companies about how they're approaching serialization issues. We're doing that in conjunction with TraceLink, and we'll send out information for that shortly. Graham?
Okay, great. This is Tim from Contract Pharma, and just want to, on behalf of Contract Pharma, thank you, Gil and Graham, for your insights. It was a great presentation, and thanks also to our sponsor TraceLink and everyone in the audience who took the time out to attend. As I mentioned at the start, this session is going to be archived for 1 year on our website, contractpharma.com. And we had a bunch of questions, so for any of those that weren't answered, Graham will be able to respond to you directly, and the folks at TraceLink have also said they will publish all questions and answers on their website as well. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.